Yeah, I'd like to point out that for addressing inequality, minimum wages is probably one of the institutions that we could look at. But at the same time, we have to remember that minimum wages alone cannot solve the problem of inequality. I think it has to come along with a number of other measures like social policies and labor market policies, which need to be well integrated along with minimum wages to have any good impacts. Having said that, we do know that legal minimum wages have been and have played a very important policy role in many countries where wage inequalities have been rising. Similarly, when the low wage sector has been expanding in a number of economies, minimum wages have played a very important role in preventing unfair competition. The third reason why minimum wages have been promoted is when you look at the full-time equivalent of working people, it tries to ensure that to some level people do not fall into the working poverty situation. So that's another role that it has played, and it has shown that it has quite some impacts in the developing world. And the other thing is that in many countries, especially in the Latin American context, we do find that minimum wages also are set at the bottom of the wage pyramid, and a number of other wages are set as multiples of it. So in a sense, we do see that the way minimum wage is set, it could play a very important role in reducing poverty and inequality. There's also enough literature with empirical evidences that is available that shows that minimum wages has an inequality enhancing role, and it can shape the wage distribution. There have been quite a few studies done for UK and the USA which show that minimum wage reduces wage inequality at the lower tail of the earnings distribution, or in the case of Brazil, where it was shown that it compresses the wage distribution in both the formal and the informal sector. There has been some evidence also showing that the erosion of minimum wages in many of the countries has also led to a rise in inequality at the lower tail or at the bottom end of the distribution. And there are some who do observe that minimum wages have improved the earnings of the middle and upper part, but a large part of the literature actually goes about showing the equality enhancing role of minimum wages. In this context, actually, we tried to see for a whole set of 11 developing countries, what are the gaps in minimum wages coverage and compliance across these countries, and whether, despite an imperfect compliance, what kind of effects minimum wages has on the wage distribution. We look at countries in Latin America, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru, some countries in Asia, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and 2 countries in Africa, South Africa and Mali, and Turkey. Now, the reason behind picking up these countries was they have different levels of development, they have different minimum wage systems, they have completely different institutional environment as far as institutions are concerned, and lastly, you have varying proportions of wage workers, because one of the arguments we often listen to while dealing with developing economies is that minimum wages doesn't mean any sense in these countries because self-employed and informal sector is very huge. But actually what we find surprising is that a very large proportion of the workers are still in wage employment. It varies across countries, but it's quite interesting and could have an impact on poverty and inequality. I'm not going to go too much into the methodology about how we got about doing this whole analysis, but I'd like to just simply say that what we have done is looked into the labor codes and the minimum wage legislations of each of the countries and tried to match the minimum wages at the 5-digit industry code of the household or the labor force surveys. So what we have done is a real matching of minimum wages to the worker employed in a particular sector. As any empirical analysis, there are measurement errors, and we would say that we would give about 5% measurement error to the study too. Now, coming down to the whole question of relevance of minimum wages, you very clearly see that you have Africa on 2 ends of the pole. You have South Africa on one hand, which has about roughly 85% of the total workers in wage employment. On the other hand, you have Mali, which is roughly about 15% in wage employment. You have many of the Latin American countries which are around 60% plus, and actually the Asian countries work around 40 to 60%. This is itself, in a sense, tries to show the importance minimum wage can play in many of these countries for reducing poverty and inequality. Now, coming down to the system of minimum wages, now this becomes very critical actually. How simplistic or complex a minimum wage system is, that can have an impact on what the outcomes could be. Now you have, among the countries that we have identified 4 different kinds of minimum wage systems. You have the simple national minimum wages in Brazil, Mali, Turkey, and Vietnam. Though Turkey and Vietnam do have minimum wages in Turkey for youth, and in Vietnam you have a differentiation between local workers and foreign workers. Whereas the second set is that of a complex and partial system of minima, where only selected industries and occupations have minimum wages, and this is a very typical case of India and South Africa. South Africa has 11 occupations which are selected and minimum wages are sectorally determined, whereas in India we have about 1,679 occupations which are part of what we call as schedules of employment, and then we have about 48 which are actually set up at the national level. So in all we have about 1,700 minimum wages, which is quite a complex, which makes the system quite complex actually, even for implementation. Then you have universal minimum wages with certain exceptions, like in the case of Indonesia and the Philippines. They're universal, but then in Indonesia, domestic workers are actually excluded. In Philippines, while the coverage shows that it is universal, what happens is that in the implementation process, a number of firms are exempted, either if they're not doing well or if they're below a certain size. Then you have hybrid systems where you have universal minimum wages with complex structures. These are Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru. To give you an example, Mexico has a universal minimum wage, but it has about 80 occupational minimum wages, which are again divided by 3 areas. They have reduced it now in the recent rounds, but till recently they had it about for 3 areas. So this is the kind of system that we are actually dealing with. So given this, what you find is that in countries which have universal systems, the coverage of minimum wages is 100%. Where there are exceptions, as you see in the case of Indonesia and Peru, this is actually the exemption of domestic workers, and where you have selected, you have only about 70% of the workers actually being covered by minimum wages. So your starting point itself makes a lot of difference, because if not everybody is covered, then it's very easy for certain sets of workers to actually suddenly be exempted or excluded and fall into not being part of the minimum wages. Now, the third important thing I think which is very important is the level at which the minimum wage is set. If it is set at too low a level, it is quite ineffective in ensuring minimum living income to workers and families. However, if it is set too high, then it can trigger price inflation, hurt unemployment, and I think much more importantly, it leads to widespread non-compliance, and this is something we'll come to quickly. So setting a minimum wage which actually offers real benefits to low-paid workers while avoiding unnecessary risks to enterprises and jobs is the key thing about setting the minimum wage. Now, if we look across the set of countries that we have analyzed and see what is the ratio of minimum to median. I know this is a very controversial issue, but I think it's very important to spend a quick moment on it. There's a general notion which exists that in the developed world, the ratio of minimum to median is about 40%, but what we see across a whole range of developing economies is this is far higher. Actually, you have most of the countries where it is, except for Mexico, Vietnam, and Mali, where it's more than 60%. There are only 3 countries where the minimum to median is quite low. And what we also see is over a period of time, in Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa, the minimum to median has actually increased. Now, if you look at the ratio of minimum to mean wages, you find that this is much lower than the ratio of minimum to median. And the, the reason for this wide range that exists, or the distance that exists between the ratio of median to median, ratio of median to ratio of mean, is largely because it basically implies that the wage distribution is very highly skewed. And that's where we need to interfere to see how you actually go about setting the minimum wages. Now, given this kind of progress that we have as to what the coverage is, what the level of minimum wage is set, if you look at compliance, it is far from compliant. There's not a single country which has full compliance, and the reasons are obvious. It could be either because of the coverage, it could be because of the level at which it is set, it could be because of the kind of institutions that are there to enforce them. It is largely that plays quite an important role to it. What you see from this figure very clearly is that you have countries like Vietnam and Mexico, which have very high compliance rate on one hand, and one might come under the simplistic argument saying that compliance is largely high, probably because the enforcement mechanism in this country is very good. But actually the story is far less simplistic than that. The reason why you have Vietnam and Mexico having a very high compliance rate is because the minimum wage that is set is so low that everybody complies with it. But this should have been a full compliance situation, but even then you see that about 10% of the population is actually not compliant. The interesting story, however, here is that of Brazil, which has observed a small decline in compliance, which could have been because of the increase of minimum to median, whereas the level is concerned. But despite that, the institution factors have actually played a very good role in ensuring that the compliance is very high. On the other hand, you have countries like India, where the compliance rate is very low, but we do see that over the last year, the compliance has actually increased, and that has to do with the new program that was introduced, which had mechanisms actually, which on one hand simplified the national minimum wage by saying that there is a minimum wage that applies to all workers in certain sectors, and also that it had social audits and information awareness campaigns, which made minimum wage implementable easy. Now, there are two mechanisms through which you can see how the minimum wage can affect the wage distribution. One is the simple kernel density estimates to see whether there are spikes in the distribution and whether there are spikes around the minimum wages. And what I've done is only taken 4 countries into consideration because of space and time. And what you find is that in Brazil, India, and Indonesia, very clearly there are spikes around the minimum wages, but that's not the case as far as Mexico is concerned, which is quite far above, which actually shows us also from the earlier pictures. The other thing that is quite interesting is when you look at the fraction at and see over a period of time whether the fraction at has increased or not, you find that in Brazil, the number of people who are getting minimum wages has actually increased, but this is not so for India and Indonesia. Now, we also tried to do the effect of minimum wages on wage distribution for all workers who are covered by minimum wages using conditional quantile regression. And what you find is that in Brazil, this is again done for 4 countries, but it's quite interesting in the way the kind of results we get here. In the case of Brazil, what you see that the minimum wage increase in the last period in 2009 has actually had a very good impact as far as the lower end of the distribution is concerned. There is a fall in the 30th to the 40th, but again there's an increase before declining. Whereas in India, you see that the impact of the NREGA program is been quite high in the second period. Very clearly the impact shows. The reason why you see that the impacts are there till the 70th is largely because we are doing this analysis for a small group of workers who are covered by minimum wages. If this was done for all workers, you would again find that the lower end of the distribution, the impacts are much higher than the higher end. Now, if you look at Indonesia, which is quite an interesting case, where the minimum to median was quite high, and the minimum to median actually increased over the 2 points of time, And as far as the compliance is concerned, the compliance actually reduced as a result of the increase of minimum to median. Now you see as a result of it, across the entire distribution, the line below, the effect of minimum wage on the wage distribution has actually declined. So this shows the criticality as far as both the level and the compliance is concerned. And Mexico, which has had the low minimum wages, you do find that there is some effect at the lower end, but then it just peters out. So I would just like to conclude by saying that despite imperfect compliance, minimum wages does have an impact on lower quantiles of the wage distribution. The issue is the right level and the kind of institutions that you needed. That is the case of Brazil. If set at low levels, you do not have any impacts. That's the case of Mexico. Enforcement does improve it, that we have seen in India, and the complexity of the system and the level and less enforcement actually leads to a case where the effects are very minimal, and that's Indonesia. Thank you very much.